The amazing thing about autism spectrum disorders, and they're termed spectrum disorders for a specific reason, and that is the demonstration or the presentation of the disorder exists along a continuum. There's no one specific way that autism is demonstrated or presents itself. So it's a spectrum disorder. You have severe cases, you have mild cases, you have different forms of it. And one of the more common higher functioning forms, so to speak, of autism spectrum disorders is something called Asperger's. Asperger's disorder is something that lots of people, it's been getting a lot of attention recently. And the interesting thing about Asperger's is that it actually was a syndrome of characteristics very, very similar to what is termed in the field as classic autism. And Hans Asperger, the individual that came up with the idea of identifying children with these specific characteristics, did his work in Austria back in the 1940s. And what was fascinating about this is he was working with kids that would eventually be considered to have Asperger's disorder or Asperger's syndrome in Austria, and writing his papers and observations at about the same time in the 1940s as a physician by the name of Leo Kanner was working with a group of kids with very similar but a little bit more severe characteristics at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. They weren't communicating with each other, but eventually they ended up identifying a group of kids that had very similar characteristics, but the Asperger kids were what we call higher functioning, and the Kanner's kids were what we call lower functioning or more classically autism. In Europe, it was considered a viable diagnostic category for several decades. It was actually the first use of it occurred somewhere in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and it was diagnosed as a syndrome, not an actual disorder. It was not included in any sort of clinical diagnostic manual, anything that a physician or a psychologist would be able to label a specific diagnosis, but it was around mostly in Europe and considered to be something along the lines of a higher functioning form of autism. In 1994, the clinical manual of mental health diagnoses decided to include it as part of the autism spectrum. So from 1994 to the present, you now have what might be considered an explosion or a new identification of all these individuals diagnosed with Asperger's. They've been around forever, it's just there never was an official diagnostic category of Asperger's disorder until 1994. The interesting thing about Asperger's disorder, or Asperger's syndrome, lots of people still like to refer it to Asperger's syndrome, and that's okay. We can flow with either one of those. The interesting thing is that since these individuals are what we call higher functioning, that they demonstrate some good social skills, they almost always, these are individuals that almost always have a real fairly decent grasp on communication. These are not non-vocal individuals. These individuals are communicating well vocally. They're actually very smart. They have solid abilities. But the problem is that their social skills are incredibly deficient. And it is one of the things that sets them apart from their peers that are typically developing, is that socially they're very awkward. They're not very competent in their ability to interact with other people. And that sets them apart. And it creates, as they get older, and move through the school system especially, it creates a lot of difficulty because they may not end up being recognized as having Asperger's until later in life, and up until that time they've struggled, their families have struggled, not knowing what's going on, and at some point in time somebody's going to step up to them hopefully and say, we might be looking at something along the lines of Asperger's.